Let's jump right into this explainer and unpack what might honestly be one of the most impossible literary goals ever attempted. Back in the 19th century, the legendary Russian author Fyodor Dostoevsky set out to write about a perfectly beautiful man. But here's the catch. He didn't want to put this perfectly beautiful man in some pristine utopia. No, he wanted to drop him right into the middle of a deeply flawed, cynical, and corrupt world. Today, we're diving into the profound philosophical and psychological depths of Dostoevsky's absolute masterpiece, The Idiot. Scholar Joseph Frank really hits the nail on the head here. The crucial point to understand is that Dostoevsky wasn't just trying to spin a compelling yarn. He was running a high-stakes psychological experiment. He was taking his own highest, most cherished ideal, this uncompromising, pure Christian love and compassion, and throwing it straight into the unforgiving crucible of St. Petersburg society. We're talking about a society completely, utterly obsessed with wealth, status, and superficial appearances.
And that brings us to the core paradox of our explainer today. Put yourself in these shoes for a second. Would you actually recognize a truly good person if you met one? Or, if someone operated with absolute innocence, without any hidden agenda or self-interest whatsoever, would you just assume they were crazy? I mean, what really happens when a truly authentic and compassionate person enters a world that simply doesn't know how to receive goodness?
To really get our main guy, Prince Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, we've got to talk about the Russian Orthodox archetype of the Urodavi, or the holy fool. When the characters in the novel dismissively call Myshkin an idiot, it's not because he lacks intelligence. In fact, he's incredibly perceptive. His idiocy is actually a highly sensitive moral radar. He flat-out refuses to play by the rules of social calculation, deception, and ego, operating instead entirely on profound spiritual insight and childlike trust. Section 1. Biography of a Fractured Mind, Epilepsy and Mortality. Let's look at the intersection of extreme physical states and mortality, because Dostoevsky's own lived trauma is what breathed life into Myshkin's psychological hyper-awareness. You see, Dostoevsky suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which is a brutal biological dialectic. First, you get the ecstatic aura, this fleeting, intense state of transcendent harmony and absolute consciousness. But that divine clarity? It's instantly shattered by a terrifying aftermath of profound darkness, helplessness, and a horrifying loss of memory and speech.
Through Myshkin, Dostoevsky practically mythologizes this aura. He explains that this fleeting harmony, this sudden, overwhelming sense of being perfectly connected to the universe, is so powerfully sweet that a person would gladly trade a decade of their life, maybe even their entire life, for just a few seconds of it. And it's exactly this extreme sensitivity to existence that makes Myshkin so deeply, painfully empathetic to the suffering of everyone around him.
But epilepsy wasn't his only brush with the extreme edges of human experience. Picture this, it's 1849. Dostoevsky is arrested for political activities and sentenced to death by firing squad. He's tied to a pillar, blindfolded, and genuinely believes he has only minutes left on Earth. Then, literally 1 minute before the execution, a deliberate hoax reprieve from the Tsar is read aloud. This agonizing brush with mortality taught Dostoevsky, and he passes this directly into Myshkin's DNA, that the true psychological horror of execution isn't the physical pain at all. It's the inescapable, maddening certainty of foreknown death. Section 2. A Society of Masks, St. Petersburg's Psychological Crucible. So we pit Myshkin's boundless compassion against the specific societal diseases of St. Petersburg. He's dropped into a society entirely driven by pride, vanity, and the desperate need for recognition. Look at how complex this psychological web is. Ganya, driven by shame and ambition, reacts to Myshkin's sincerity with defensive cruelty. Ippolit's existential dread turns into pure resentment. Rogashin's dark, possessive obsession leads to violence, completely missing Myshkin's pure love. And the tragic Nastasia Filipovna, drowning in guilt, ultimately rejects the saving grace Myshkin offers, convinced she just doesn't deserve it. They're all completely disarmed and confused by a man who simply refuses to manipulate them.
Section 3. The Existential Threat, a Masterpiece of Decay.
Now, the ultimate antagonist in this story isn't actually a person, and it isn't just society's vanity. It's a brutal confrontation with biology, nature, and mortality, and Dostoevsky expresses this brilliantly through art, using a technique called ekphrasis. It's basically a literary shortcut where you vividly describe an artwork within the text to achieve deep philosophical insight. Dostoevsky was kind of obsessed with form, fearing his own ideas might become as incoherent as an epileptic seizure. So he used ekphrasis to encode perfect, immutable ideas right into the minds of his readers. Which brings us to the visceral, absolute horror Prince Myshkin experiences when he first sees a reproduction of Hans Holbein the Younger's 1521 painting, The Body of the Dead Christ in the Tomb. It's an image that haunts the entire narrative of the explainer we're exploring today, acting as the ultimate test of faith.
When you actually look at the painting, it's rough. It shows a bruised, emaciated, decaying corpse, completely devoid of any divine beauty or even a hint of resurrection. As scholar Tatiana Gerner points out, Holbein divorces the divine from the physical, depicting only the brutal surface truth of death. For the characters, viewing this painting isn't some comforting encounter with salvation, it's a terrifying stare into the senseless, empty abyss facing modern man.
Now, scholars are kind of split on this. Olga Mearson argues it shows divine kenosis, which is God voluntarily emptying himself of divinity to fully share in human suffering. But art critic Michel Onfray makes a truly terrifying observation. He points out that the unclosed eyes and mouth give the impression that Christ is staring directly up at the heavens, actively horrified by what death actually has in store. It brutally erodes the possibility that spiritual ideals can ever overcome physical reality.
This exact painting deeply messes with the dying youth Ippolit. He uses it in his agonizing, essential explanation to argue that nature is nothing more than an enormous, implacable, dumb beast. He describes existence as a vast, modern machine that just pointlessly seizes and dismembers even the most priceless beings, even Christ himself. If nature's laws are really this absolute and cruel, existence is entirely absurd, which eventually leads Ippolit to a desperate, tragic suicide attempt.
Section 4. The limits of passive empathy.
So here's the multi-million-dollar question. If Myshkin is so incredibly good, so deeply compassionate, and so intuitively understanding, why does his extreme goodness ultimately fail to save anyone? Well, we're basically watching the tragic downfall of unchecked idealism in real time. It starts with indiscriminate mercy. Myshkin constantly forgives everyone without setting any boundaries whatsoever. But because he lacks those boundaries, he inadvertently becomes an enabler. He can't decisively step in to stop Rogojin's violence or Nastasia's spiral into self-ruin. His passive empathy literally becomes complicit in their tragedy. Finally, confronted with the horrific aftermath of all this destruction, his mind breaks. He retreats permanently into the darkness of his illness, totally entombed in his own passivity.
Section 5. Grounding the Ideal, Myshkin versus Alyosha.
It's striking to see how Dostoevsky synthesizes and tries to solve this agonizing problem of the fallen ideal in his later work. Myshkin represents the ungrounded, almost clinically pure aesthetic ideal, a passive empathy that leaves him isolated and broken. But jump forward to his final novel, The Brothers Karamazov, and Dostoevsky gives us Alyosha, the grounded, incarnate ideal. Alyosha steps right out into the messy, complicated reality of the world to practice active, boundaried love. Unlike Myshkin, who ends up entombed, Alyosha literally walks out of a graveyard at the end of his story to guide humanity. Dostoevsky realized that for goodness to survive in the real world, it has to be robust, active, and rooted in the reality of human struggle.
Which leaves us with this final, incredibly provocative thought, bringing it all right back to today. We've seen how society systematically dismantled the perfectly beautiful man. So ask yourself, does our modern society still treat radical kindness, vulnerability, and authenticity as a form of idiocy? Are we honestly any better equipped to receive true goodness today than they were in 19th century St. Petersburg? Thank you for exploring the incredible depths of Dostoevsky with us in this explainer. Keep questioning and keep learning.